Welcome to Comic Crackle, I'm your host. Have you ever heard of Watchmen? You know, the one that's written by Alan Moore with art by Dave Gibbons. It was one of the books that basically revolutionized the comics industry and how it's perceived today. Well, suffice to say, it's pretty good. Although the comics industry learned the wrong lessons from it, equating quality to grittiness. There's been multiple attempts at recapturing the story that was told within Watchmen, with the majority falling short. In my opinion, the majority fall flat because they're not going for the same aspects that made Watchmen unique. Watchmen was a critical piece that analyzed the need for superheroes. Every supposed hero is a self-righteous, inept sociopath that's enacting the will upon others, and they do so through Randian ideology that might makes right. There's no heroes in Watchmen. That's the point. It reflects its themes clearly, but also reflects the political turmoil of the time during the 1980s. With a threat of nuclear holocaust imminent and rising tensions with Russia, the American people lived in a continuous state of fear. They were unknowing of what the future held because ultimately the political leaders were the deciding factor. Watchmen puts the POV on the vigilantes and draws comparisons to those of political leaders doing what's right for the greater good. When other would-be successors attempt to replicate the success of Watchmen, they water down the provocative nature to serve the largest demographic of reader. While I genuinely hate a Watchmen comparison, 20th Century Men is able to continue those themes while being wholly original. I won't talk about any spoilers in this video, although I do think that it's unable to be spoiled because of its density. I strictly just want to make this video as a love letter to the creators and entice the viewer, that's you, to read the book for the first time, or if you've already read it, read it again. I don't make the rules. But before we get into the book, let's hear a word from our sponsor. That's capitalism, baby! Do you want to read comics outside of the standard big two over at DC and Marvel, but don't know where to start? Well, do I have the perfect service for you? Global Comics is a service that allows you to read over 70,000 comics from 350 different publishers, including Image, Dark Horse, Boom Studios, Oni Press, and so much more. Do you want to read 20th Century Men? This is where I read it, so you should too. Also, they just partnered with DC Comics to provide select titles, so it's really your one-stop shop for all of your comic needs. My favorite part of Global Comics is that they take the money that you pay for the subscription, and up to 70% of that subscription goes back to the creators from the works that you read. This provides creators with royalties based on your reading habits. With new issues published daily and more creators and publishers moving over to the app, this is the perfect time to start your journey and expand your comic palette. Go to the link in the description or in the app, use the code COMICCRACKLE at checkout and get your first year for $59.99. Thank you to Global Comics for sponsoring this video, and now back to the regularly scheduled programming. Before we talk about the story, we need to talk about Deniz Camp. He's had this recent explosion in the comics industry, and I find his career fascinating. The first time I heard of him was because of this series, and it propelled him to being an indie darling. What I found interesting was the choice to have him lead the 2024 iteration of the Ultimates. I knew that Hickman was trying something different with this new Ultimate Universe, but I found the decision perplexing because you're taking a relative newcomer and having him lead one of the 4 leading titles. Well, oh boy was I wrong. Although Ultimate Spider-Man is getting the majority of the chatter from fans, the Ultimates has made its way to being a standout for the new Ultimate Universe. So being the person that I am, I wanted to track the source of this rising star, and it led me back to 20th Century Men. When doing research on Camp, I found multiple interviews where he talked about his childhood and his relationship to comics. Deniz was born in the Philippines and at a young age moved to the United States. He was born to a Turkish father and a Filipino mother. They would move to Lansing, Michigan, where both of his parents would teach at Michigan State University. Camp says that it was difficult being the son of 2 immigrants and struggling to identify with American culture. He says this compounded in the wake of 9/11 and the subsequent Islamophobia that ensued. Having a deep state of loneliness, he searched for something that would provide an escape escape, as well as something that he could relate to his peers with. This is where he found comic books. He says that at first he related to the power fantasy aspect, but then later he found what he was looking for: relatability. Deniz states that Superman's relationship with Krypton is the perfect encapsulation of how he felt, as well as the duality of identity. Camp would draw comparisons between his identity at home and his identity with his peers to that of secret identities for superheroes. Do you remember the Absolute Universe video where I said that Deniz Camp would be the perfect writer for the new reinvention of Superman? DC, if you're listening, get Camp on the phone right now. Deniz found a love for the medium and would read every comic that he could get his hands on. Specifically, he would recount the times that his mother would drop him off at Barnes & Noble and he'd be there for hours at a time. He would find books that he loved and books that he didn't, and he would dissect what made one good comparatively to the other. He says that his first experience with identifying creators as individuals was Grant Morrison's JLA. Going from there, Camp would read based on the creators and not just the character. From this point, he also found Alan Moore. Camp cites Morrison and Moore as his primary influences and praises their work for telling layered and complex stories that don't talk down to the reader. There's a point that he makes that I absolutely love, and he talks about the difference between writing for disposability and writing for the craft. While comics can be empty calories and made for endless consumption, if the reader isn't being challenged, then ultimately the story is only there to be read and disposed of. I want to talk about this in a future video, but Camp is hitting on my thoughts regarding challenging versus comfy comics. Camp was enamored with the medium, but we all have to grow up sometime. So he pursued a degree in medicine with a minor in cellular molecular biology. So he's smart. After graduating, he went abroad to practice in Turkey and South America, but he realized that that's not what he wanted. He says that the majority of the time is spent on paperwork and not patient focused. He didn't have the drive for it that he once did because he wanted to help people directly. So something needed to change. So in his off time, he would come back to comics. He would rekindle his adoration for Morrison and Moore, and he even had a Tumblr page where he would dissect their work. He just like me for real. From there, he would begin working on fan-created pitches for characters of the big two. Deniz, if you're watching, I promise I'm not going to embarrass you too much. However, a friend of mine did find scripts for a fan-made comic for Shazam, and even pitches for characters like Mr. Miracle. Okay, that settles it. Mr. Camp, if you want to come onto the channel, just let me know. He submitted to a talent showcase held by Mark Millar in 2016, and this is where he got published for the first time. After this, he would start getting work at publishers like Scout, Valiant, Vault, and even working on Ice Cream Man's Quarantine issue, which earned him a Ringo Award. Around this time, he sought out to work with the comic artist Stipan Morian, and they would formulate a creator-owned series, which turned out to be 20th Century Men. When I was writing the previous section, I knew that people were going to wonder why I spent so long on the background. And I'll tell you, it's about perspective. 20th Century Men deals with perspective, and it's one of the leading themes. It's a pontification of how we view war and those who are overlooked. I think it would be easy to just omit the background and look into the camera and just keep on repeating, buy this book, it's good, for an undisclosed amount of time, but I feel like that would be irresponsible. I feel like it's a necessity to highlight the importance of this book and why this story matters not only now, but continuously. If we don't know our history, we're doomed to repeat it. It's a simple saying, but it carries the weight of atrocities experienced by all of humanity. Empathy can't be taught, but understanding the importance of perspective can. Everybody believes that they're the hero of their own story, and those against them are the villains. In 20th Century Men, this takes shape in multiple forms. It makes the reader confront their biases, and it also forces them to acknowledge those impacted by the will of capitalistic greed and nationalistic imperialism. Now, if you just heard those words and you're immediately antagonistic, I beg you, please read this book. If you refute the notion, then you should challenge yourself and your ideals. Art is made to force us to ask questions, and the refusal to interact with something that challenges you is to embrace stagnation. How can you know what you stand for if you're not educated on what you stand against? The story takes place in the alternate history version of the 1980s, set during the actual events of Russia's invasion of Afghanistan and the United States' response. In 1979, Russia invaded Afghanistan, and this would later be named the Soviet-Afghan War. This was at the height of the Cold War, and it was seen as Russia trying to expand its influence and amass control. Before this, Russia had not laid claim to nations beyond the Eastern Bloc, so this was the impetus for nations to raise alarm. While Russia was attempting to enact imperialistic domination, the United States and their European allies saw this as the opportunity to put a stop to the spread of communism. And they did this the only way that they know how: war. The problem with the American involvement is that they did not care for the people of Afghanistan, but were trying to maintain control of the oil produced in the country. Leading up to the invasion by Russia, the Carter administration was aware of their involvement and relations with the Afghanistani people, and in hopes of avoiding their full control, they provided aid to the revolutionary forces of the Mujahideen. The war was fought by proxy, allowing for the United States and their allies to secure capitalistic interests, and also avoiding putting their citizens at risk. 3 million civilians, or about 11.5% of the Afghanistan population, were killed in this conflict. And due to their political instability, the governing powers were taken over by the Taliban. So what does this have to do with 20th century men? This is the historical context for the series. It's crucial to understand that this story is more than just a comic I love, but it's about the people that lost their lives due to where they were born. It's about the imperialist forces dismantling their way of life and leaving a destruction in their wake. These are the themes of the series. The shifting perspectives of the various protagonists lends to the understanding of the impacts of war and what it does to everyone that's involved. Now that you have the proper background, let's dive into the book. The story depicts the political superpowers of the United States and Russia being fought with literal superpowers. Okay, that kind of undersells the entirety of the story, but the execution is where the focus is duly needed. The deviation between our world and the fictionalized one is the presence of superheroes, but these heroes only operate for nationalistic interests. On behalf of America, we have the bloodthirsty and sociopathic Captain America, who's also president of the United States. He's the embodiment of the Uncle Sam iconography, but he's emblematic of the need for violence due to imperialistic hegemony. For Russia, we have a Iron Man analog, but it shows him devoid of the American idealism. He's just a soldier that needs conflict to live. He's routinely depicted within his armor, and he's rarely shown outside of it, visually demonstrating that he needs his armor just like he needs violence. He can't allow for himself to be vulnerable, so he must remain in the suit and protected at all times. I think the most fascinating part of his character is that he's depicted to have his arms dragging on the ground, almost to show him as primal or like a Neanderthal. There's also allegories to the Hulk and Superman, with the Hulk's iteration being the depiction of the militaristic brutality devoid of glamour. And it shows this bloodlust as the ultimate truth behind America's military-industrial complex. Superman's iteration exemplifies how hope is dependent on the collective and not the individual, meaning that while propaganda works in the short term, structural inequality will decay hope and inevitably reveal the foundational realities. Outside of allegorical figures, we also have an Afghani woman who's willing to do whatever it takes if it means the betterment of her people. And also there's a Soviet reporter who's not interested in propaganda, but he wants to find the truth behind the violence. With the narrative flowing between characters, each issue allows for the reader to get into the subconscious of these characters and why they see themselves as the hero. All of the characters are attempting to extinguish this conflict while simultaneously finding their proximity to the horrors of of war. There's a reimagination of the historical events that are changed because of the presence of superheroes and how they function as mechanisms for propaganda. These supposed heroes embody the structural flaws of their respective countries. Remember when I said this book is a lot like Watchmen? Yeah, that's why. Typically, when books are attempting to replicate Watchmen's success, the protagonists are freedom fighters or searching for truth. Within 20th Century Men, these characters embody the traits of their respective countries, and it leads to them experiencing the savagery of violence. And this violence is depicted in an intimate level. It forces the character's perspective to see the cyclical nature of violence. The series shows an honesty that's subtle but impactful. It shows these characters with the realization that they're not the shield, but they're the sword. Deniz speaks about the incorporation of historical events in Afghanistan by stating, "I knew I wanted to ground the story in the real world, and I wanted it to be a story of one of the greatest superpowers exerting its will on some other less powerful, less influential country." And a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is stuff that recurs. All this stuff is cyclical. So a lot of the stuff in 20th Century Men was me as much commenting on America's occupation of Afghanistan as it was the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. But I think by setting it in the past, it gave us the freedom to talk about things that are equally relevant today, but in a way that maybe has people trip over it a little bit less. Afghanistan has been the center of the world at various times and has, for my lifetime, been war-torn and absolutely devastated by what they would call the Western powers. So it was a crucial place in world history, and is so often the case in my lifetime, these places that were once vibrant and developing on their own, and safe and wonderful, they're so quickly turned into something else. It's showing the folly of nationalism and the endpoint for characters that operate with diplomatic immunity and an undying loyalty to their country. While the story does condemn the actions of these characters, it also showcases that they're just cogs in the machine. They serve the interest of their respective governing entities and put that over the interests of the collective population. It also presents this in the individual autonomy of choice. Do we choose violence, or are the machines of propaganda and governance built in a way to serve imperialism and capital? Additionally, while we see ourselves as individuals as righteous, is our morality defined by our actions, or does our complacency and atrocities influence our righteousness? Notably, the varying languages play a large proponent in the story. If I'm to analyze, it's symbolic of the inability to communicate between adversaries, and the only universal language is death and destruction. And it forces these characters to reluctantly understand each other. It's the darkest version of understanding, and it serves to demonize the opposition, which is exactly what propaganda is made to be. It can't be overstated how much the collaborative process means to the book. Stipan Morian's pencils are unmatched. He's able to perfectly distill the emotion in any of the scenes within the series, and even adapting the stylization based on what the story calls for. As I was doing research, the common sentiment was that people thought that there were multiple artists on this book solely because of the vast changes fluctuating scene by scene. And yeah, man, I can't explain it either. He just somehow does that. Morian describes the difficulty and the artistic depiction of the series by stating, "What we were saying all the time is that the story is the most important thing. Everything was about emotion, and I was trying in every way to give what I thought was needed in that moment. I wasn't really looking at a way to present myself and show my style and show this and that, you know? So I would try the craziest things. There are digital pages, there are pages that are really big. I mean, Hal Foster big, like huge, you know? And there are pages that are tiny. I was drawing on pieces of paper. I was trying everything just to get in touch with the story to bring the message across. I found myself being captivated by every scene, but the set pieces especially so. There's a moment when a character is directly witnessing the impacts of military violence, and with any other artist, they would show blood-soaked pages and even glamorizing the violence depicted. But that's not what this book is. Instead, these moments are illustrated illustrated with quiet reflection, showcasing a metaphor for what happens, but allowing for the reader to experience it with deafening clarity. There's a deeper mastery of coloring decisions going from scene to scene. Pardon the pun, but they're not painting every scene with a broad brush. Sacrifices that are depicted in the art utilize focal points, making the tragedies carry so much more weight. This leads for a deeper sense of emotional resonance. Deniz did say in multiple interviews that he wrote issues and then rewrote issues based on what was received from the art. He wanted the script to equate to the quality of the artistic decisions rendered. He did say that he would send in a script to Stipan and then get back the work that elaborated on scenes, allowing for emotional resonance and pacing of the story. Camp speaks about the creation process with Morian, stating, "As we kept talking about it, I think a lot of his experiences and my experiences were going into the work, and I knew I wanted it to become a book about different perspectives. I wanted it to become a book about how this one large event could be seen and experienced by different people, and especially seeing the way Stipan was changing his style and his approach for every scene, depending on the character and the location, only further assured that we could do this in a different, interesting way, where each character had their own perspective on the events, and each of those perspectives was sympathetic and true for them, and taken individually were, I hope, compelling and truthful. But taken all together, you got kind of a different story and a more complete view of things. And I wish I could say that was my plan originally. That's really something that came about as much by my fellow creators as anything I came up with. It's the brilliance of a full creative team who are able to elevate the other and make for a master class in comics. No one person's contributions outweigh the other. And I think this is where comics are great. Throughout this video, I've spoken at length about the importance of choice and those that are stripped of their autonomy to serve the interests of governing bodies. While I was reading the story for the first time, I kept drawing parallels between the Afghani people and the current population of Palestine. These people have been stripped of their dignity and rights, and they continue to experience unprecedented levels of oppression by Israel that's also aided by the United States. Much like the history of Afghanistan, the Palestinian people are under continuous threat due to their proximity to powerful forces. They're experiencing an ethnic cleansing at the hands of people that claim righteousness. At time of recording, the International Criminal Court has issued warrants for the Prime Minister and the former Defense Minister. They've been accused of, and video evidence of them admitting to doing war crimes against the Palestinian people. I feel like it would be irresponsible to omit this genocide as I'm covering a book that asks the reader one thing: how can we justify the loss of innocent lives, and how is violence on the path to freedom? I refuse to be silent about this, and I also refuse to believe that there's a rationality to violence and treating a population like it's a monolith. Listed below, I'll include some donation links and sources to Palestinian relief funds. Thank you for watching this video. Please read 20th Century Men and free Palestine.